All right, good afternoon, everyone. After a very interesting People Gap session, it is now my pleasure to introduce the speaker of our last Gap Summit session of the day.
I'd like to introduce Boris Azaïs. And Boris is Director of Public Policy, Europe and Canada for MSD, Merck. And I'd like for those of you that may not know the difference between Merck, the American Merck, and Merck Serono that you saw, they are two separate companies. So the Merck, the American Merck, which is represented in Europe under the name MSD, is a separate company from the Merck Serono of this morning or this afternoon. Yes, Boris?
Thank you. Well, I'll stay here since I don't have any slides. And the big difference is that Merck Serono, the German company, is a sponsor, and I'm just a speaker. So that's the difference. So MSD, an American company. And over dinner, I can tell you the whole story because it goes back to the involvement of the US government in the First World War. So, since there was already a lot of content covered here, I decided that I would share with you the policy perspective, basically. What does all this mean, and why, are we talking about the regulatory gap? And I want to encapsulate it with two main concepts, signaling and convergence. And those two things, signaling and convergence, are basically the key enablers of pharmaceutical innovation. Signaling is basically the government sending out a strong message to innovators that it wants a certain result. We want innovative medicines, or we are launching the war against cancer. That's very strong political commitment, but obviously this signaling is also taking place through a complex framework of incentives, such as IP rights, and also investment in science and investment in healthcare. So when you think about why we have pharmaceutical innovation, why we have products today that can treat patients, it's because basically during the 20th century, a number of government policies have been put in place. First, governments have invested in science, basic science and higher education, like here, and that enables innovators to identify targets and go after therapeutic targets. They've invested also in healthcare. All our healthcare systems have been built during the 20th century, and that has enabled a market, basically, a market that made it possible for people to have access to innovative therapies that were, in any case, very expensive on any given level. And thirdly, they've developed something that you can call industrial policy, which is a mix of incentives such as intellectual property rights, but market access to financing and so forth. So this all together is producing pharmaceutical innovation. And when you're discussing pharmaceutical policy, what it takes for governments to trigger innovation in pharmaceuticals, and biologics and all the whole medicines, it's always taking a shade of those policies. And what's very fascinating about any debate about pharmaceuticals is that you can take this argument from an industrial standpoint and say we need jobs and growth, but you can also take it from a scientific standpoint and say, is that truly innovative? Or a healthcare standpoint. For example, quality of life measurements might, make a big difference for patients versus something that would be looked at as amazingly innovative. And so basically that's the signaling. And convergence is really something that is happening very recently, and some of which has been already mentioned today, which is the idea that because of the complexity of the whole healthcare R&D enterprise, with all its life cycle going over 20, 30 years for any given product, it means that stakeholders have to come together, discuss and dialogue on, and share their values, share their goals, and share their solutions. And what you're seeing today, and for at least since the last decade, is an enmeshing of those research agendas, healthcare agenda, and what are the tools, what are the type of signaling and incentives that can make it happen. So This is, pretty abstract, but very concretely, when you're thinking about setting the research and development agenda, apart from those historical moments when, the U.S. government needed penicillin for its soldiers, or when, Richard Nixon launched this so-called war against cancer, you have increasingly a discussion that started in the mid-2000, 2004, 2005, and that was triggered by what we used to call the innovation drought, the fact that it became very difficult, or the companies, the pharmaceutical industry was developing or bringing to product bringing to the market less products than before. And so that triggered a lot of concern and discussion. And it started with the WHO report on priority medicines for the world and Europe, which was published in 2004, 2005. And basically, it's an attempt by a health authority to set what could be a research and development agenda. What are the unmet medical needs? We need, what do governments can tell their research facility what they need? Similarly, because there was this concern about the decreased efficiency of the R&D efforts, the fact that it took increasing amount of money to bring a single product to the market, the FDA launched something called the critical path in 2007. There's really a very good seminal report from the FDA looking at the challenges that regulatory was putting on the innovation because of the high cost of failures at a late stage. So how can we signal to the innovators that certain things will not make it? And so since the higher cost of clinical development are at the latest phases, then if you equip innovators with strong signals through dialogue and sharing, methods and solutions, then eventually you're going to cut down on the price of research and enable more efficient R&D investments. And similarly, something that is happening since mostly the crisis, because the austerity measures that were triggered by the financial crisis triggered also a huge sort of wave of price cuts and really pushing back from payers in Europe on their pharmaceutical expenditures. So you have to remember that pharmaceutical expenditures represent about 15-16% of the health budget. But still, since it's a high item, easily identified, they're putting pressure on that. But since then, because there's also this, also an industrial policy component to what governments have in mind, they're coming back, and there are increasingly a number of what we call framework agreements between industry associations mainly, and governments. And we have examples in a number of countries in Europe where they're trying to basically set the agenda of what could be a sustainable pricing and reimbursement model for their country. And they do that in partnership. And you have also examples here in the UK between the UK industry, ABPI, and NICE, which is the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, which is in charge of running cost-effectiveness studies or health technology assessments. And there's a partnership that was announced last month between the industry and NICE exactly on that. How can we set the agenda on what would be required to bring cost-effectiveness studies, sharing, again, values, goals, and solutions. So I think on the most active part of this debate, as you could see, is really the regulatory framework with what Melanie presented on the adaptive approval. You have to basically understand that regulatory approval, allowing a drug to come to the market, is based on a sort of big bang decision. So we accumulate data in very constrained, scientifically conducted randomized clinical trial. And we accumulate this data, and bam, we're going to get a market approval that will launch, enable the launch of the product and reach patients all over the market. What we're moving towards is something much more staggered, much more adapted to the information that we really have from what is working for the patients. And the idea is actually to accelerate this approval earlier than like a big bang approach, but also to measure what is really going on in the patient population that is broadening little by little. It's a very challenging model because it requires actually a lot of data and validated data to be at hand, something that healthcare systems are not yet able to produce, but as they are increasingly so moving towards to patient registries and IT-enabled electronic records and so forth, then eventually we're going to be able to harness all this real-world data and turn this into clinical evidence. So the reason I wanted to bring these two concepts, signaling and convergence, is because in your career, whatever you choose, you're going to have to think about what are the government policies that enable what you're trying to achieve. And they will play a role. And in the pharmaceutical research area, they are quite complex and numerous. It's not just how much money is invested in science. It's also how much money a government is ready to pay for the final product that will make it to the market. And that information, that signal, is basically moving back into towards the pipeline, and it does inform some of the investment decisions made in R&D. And so eventually, everybody around the table, including foundations, patient groups, civil society, are now increasingly involved in setting the agenda, and that's an opportunity, but also very challenging for the people who are already in place, including regulators and industry. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions.